Maya Whitfield had been at her new desk for exactly 11 minutes when the flowers arrived, and by minute 12 they were already gone. She had placed them there herself, a small bouquet of red and white carnations from the corner shop near her apartment, a tiny act of claiming the space as her own on her very first morning as executive secretary to Ishiro Tanaka. The vase sat beside her monitor, catching the early light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 52nd floor, and for one full minute Maya let herself believe that a new job in a new city might actually go the way she had planned it. Then the office door opened, and the temperature of the room changed before the man himself even finished stepping through it. Ishiro Tanaka moved like stillness had a shape, like the air rearranged itself around him rather than the other way around. He wore black without a single ornament, his shirt open one button past formal, and his eyes swept the outer office once, cataloging, before landing on the vase of carnations with an expression that gave away nothing and somehow said everything. "Move those," he said, not to Maya, but to the man standing quietly near the bookshelf, an associate whose name she did not yet know. His voice was low, even unhurried, the kind of voice that did not need volume to be obeyed. The associate crossed the room without a word, lifted the vase from her desk, and carried it out before Maya had fully processed that it was happening to her flowers, on her desk, on her first day. "Excuse me," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Those were mine." Ishiro's gaze finally settled on her, dark and unreadable, taking her in with the same efficiency he had used to assess the flowers. "This office does not have flowers." "That is not an answer." Maya stood, because sitting while being spoken to like an object did not sit right with her, had never sat right with her, not in any job she had ever held. "It is a policy, with no explanation." Something flickered behind his eyes, brief and gone before she could name it. "You are the new secretary, Maya Whitfield." She did not offer her hand, because something told her he would not take it, and she was not going to stand there with her hand extended into empty air for the sake of politeness. "Starting today, as you clearly already know. I know everyone who works on this floor before they arrive." He said it the way another man might mention the weather, flat, unbothered, a simple statement of fact that happened to carry an edge of warning underneath it. "You should know that flowers in this office attract attention I do not want. That is the only explanation you are owed, and it is more than most people receive from me on their first morning." Maya held his gaze, refusing to be the first one to look away, even though every instinct told her that staring down a man who commanded a room without raising his voice was not a survival strategy that would serve her well. "Understood," she said, though her tone made it clear that understanding was not the same as agreement. He studied her another moment, something calculating behind the stillness, and then he turned and disappeared into the inner office without another word, leaving Maya standing alone at her desk with an empty spot where her flowers used to be and a strange, unsettled feeling she could not immediately name. That was the moment everything changed, though she would not understand the shape of it for weeks. The rest of that first day passed in the particular blur of a woman trying to memorize an entire filing system while pretending she had not just watched her employer erase a bouquet of carnations like it was a security threat. Maya learned the phone lines, learned which calls were routed straight through and which were screened for hours, learned that the man named Daisuke, who kept close to Ishiro's shoulder, carried himself like a soldier standing post rather than an assistant doing paperwork. By 5 o'clock she had a headache from holding her spine too straight, and a growing certainty that whatever she had signed up for was not investment consulting in any sense the recruiter had implied. She had taken this job because it paid nearly double what her last position offered, executive assistant work for a private investment firm that occupied the top 3 floors of a Shinjuku tower, the kind of salary that let her finally stop choosing between rent and everything else. The recruiter had described Ishiro Tanaka as a private and demanding employer who valued discretion above all else, and Maya, 22 years old and 6 months into a new city, had not asked too many questions, because 6 figures a year did not require her to ask questions she suspected she did not want answered anyway. By her second week, she understood the shape of things more clearly, even if nobody had said it out loud. The men who moved through the outer office were not investment associates. The meetings that happened behind Ishiro's closed door did not sound like portfolio reviews. The way certain visitors bowed slightly before speaking to him, the way his associates went quiet the instant he entered a room, the way one man's hands shook visibly as he waited outside the office for an audience Maya suspected he did not want to have. She was intelligent enough to add the numbers and honest enough with herself to admit what they equaled. She kept working anyway, because the rent was due regardless of what she chose to notice, and because some quiet part of her had already decided that walking away from this particular puzzle felt harder than staying to solve it. There was also, if she was honest with herself late at night in her small apartment across the city, a version of curiosity that had nothing to do with money at all, a pull toward understanding the shape of a man who commanded absolute silence from grown armed men without ever once raising his voice. Ishiro said very little to her directly in those first 2 weeks, communicating mostly through short instructions delivered without preamble, but she noticed things about him the way she noticed discrepancies in a schedule, small and precise, and impossible to unsee once seen. He took his coffee black, no exceptions. He read every document twice before signing it, the second read always slower than the first. He never raised his voice, not once, not even when an associate delivered news that made his jaw tighten and his hands go still against his desk in a way that looked more dangerous than any shout could have. And he said her name differently than anyone else in the office did. The others called her Miss Whitfield, formal and clipped. Ishiro said Maya, and something in the way he shaped the syllables made her pulse do something she refused to acknowledge, a small hitch she buried under professionalism every single time. The first real crack in the distance between them came on a Thursday evening, when Maya stayed late finishing a set of documents Ishiro needed before a morning meeting, and the building had gone quiet enough that she could hear the elevator settle 2 floors below. She was reorganizing a filing cabinet near the inner office when she heard raised voices, unusual in a place that normally operated in near silence, and then the unmistakable sound of a scuffle, quick and violent, followed by a single sharp thud against the wall. She should have called for security. She should have stayed exactly where she was and pretended she had heard nothing. Instead, she moved toward the sound. She found Ishiro in the small private study adjoining his office, standing over a man who lay motionless on the floor, blood at his temple, a second man circling with a blade already drawn, clearly having underestimated how fast Ishiro could move even in an expensive suit. Maya's mind went sharp and clear the way it always did under pressure, the panic arriving a half-second behind the calculation, and she grabbed the heavy glass paperweight from the study's side table and threw it hard at the armed man's head, catching him at the temple with enough force to stagger him. It was enough. Ishiro closed the distance in that single stolen second, and what followed was fast and economical and utterly without hesitation, the kind of violence that looked less like a fight and more like a demonstration of inevitability. When it was over, both intruders lay still on the floor, and Ishiro stood breathing evenly, straightening his cuffs with hands that did not shake at all. "You should not have come in here," he said, though his eyes, when they found hers, held something closer to shock than anger. "You are welcome," Maya said, her own hands trembling now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go, though she kept her voice steady through sheer force of will. "I could have called security. I chose to throw a paperweight at a man with a knife instead. I am aware that was not the smartest option available. It was effective." Something almost like respect moved behind his eyes. "Most people freeze. I am not most people." She looked down at the men on the floor, then back at him, her pulse still hammering hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. "Are you hurt?"
No.
He did not elaborate, and something in his expression told her not to press, that whatever had just happened was already being filed away, processed, and moved past with the same efficiency he brought to everything else. "Go home, Maya. Not until someone tells me what just happened in your office." His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he would simply refuse, order her out the way he had ordered the flowers off her desk. Instead, he exhaled, slow and controlled, and gestured toward the 2 chairs near the window.
"Seat."
"I will tell you what you need to know, and nothing more." What he told her, in careful measured sentences, was that a rival faction from Osaka had been probing his organization for weeks, testing the boundaries of his territory, and that tonight's intrusion was meant as a message rather than a true assassination attempt. He did not tell her his own history beyond that, but something in the careful way he avoided a particular subject made Maya's instincts hum with a sense that there was more beneath the surface, some old wound he kept locked as tightly as his office door. There was a night before that, a smaller one, that Maya would later understand as the first true crack in the wall between them. Ishiro had asked her to stay behind to translate a set of shipping documents that had come through with inconsistent totals, and the two of them had ended up standing shoulder to shoulder at the long table in the study, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him through his sleeve. He smelled of cedar and something darker underneath, smoke maybe, or old leather. And when his hand reached past her to turn a page, his knuckles brushed the back of her wrist, and neither of them moved away from the contact as quickly as professionalism would have suggested. "You caught something my accountant missed," he said, studying the number she had circled. "Twice now. I told you. Chaos into columns." She kept her eyes on the page instead of his face, aware of how close he was standing, aware that awareness itself was a kind of admission she was not ready to make out loud. "It is not a skill I invented for this office. I have always been good at finding what does not add up. Most people who work for me do not want to find what does not add up. They find it easier not to look." His voice had gone lower, quieter, the kind of quiet that filled a room instead of emptying it. "You look anyway. I have never known how to do it any other way." She finally glanced up, and his eyes were already on her, steady, unreadable, and for one long, suspended second neither of them said anything at all, the silence between them thick enough to touch. Then his phone buzzed against the desk, shattering it, and he stepped back, and the moment folded itself away like it had never happened, though Maya carried the memory of his knuckles against her wrist home with her that night, and did not examine too closely why. She learned the shape of that wound 3 weeks later, in a rare, unguarded moment when Ishiro had been drinking slightly more than usual after a tense negotiation and Maya had stayed behind to finish paperwork rather than leave him alone with whatever mood had settled over him. "I had a wife once," he said, without preamble, staring out at the city lights rather than at her. "Reiko."
She was not part of this life.
She believed, foolishly, that she could love a man in my position and remain untouched by what that position required. He turned his glass slowly on the desk, the ice inside it catching the light. "She was killed in an act meant to send a message to me. I have spent every year since making certain that particular message is never repeated." "I am sorry," Maya said quietly, and she meant it, the words carrying none of the performative sympathy she suspected he usually received. "Most people say that to get something from me afterward." His eyes cut to her, sharp despite the whiskey. "What do you want, Maya?" "Nothing." She held his gaze steadily. "I am saying it because it is true. I know what it costs to lose someone you are not ready to lose. I do not know your particular version of that grief, but I recognize the shape of it." Something shifted in his face then, some barrier lowering by a fraction, and he did not look away from her for a long, uncomfortable moment that neither of them named. Word of the break-in spread through the organization fast, and Maya noticed the shift in how the men on the floor treated her afterward, less like an outsider tolerated for her efficiency, and more like someone who had been tested and had not run. Daisuke, in particular, began stopping by her desk with small updates he was not strictly required to share, treating her with a wary respect that she did not yet fully understand the weight of. She told herself it meant nothing beyond professional courtesy, and mostly believed it, though some quiet instinctive part of her had already begun cataloging the way people moved differently around her now, the way Ishiro's world had started to make a small deliberate space for her presence in it. The danger around them did not ease after that night. If anything, it sharpened, the Osaka faction growing bolder as weeks passed, testing new angles, and Maya found herself pulled deeper into the machinery of Ishiro's world whether she intended to be or not. She began noticing patterns in the men who visited the office, recognizing faces that repeated too often near the building's entrance, cataloging small discrepancies in schedules and deliveries the way she had once cataloged discrepancies in corporate budgets. When she brought her observations to Ishiro, laying out a pattern she had noticed in the timing of certain deliveries that did not match anything on the official calendar, he studied the information with the same intensity he brought to everything, and something in his expression told her the pattern mattered more than she had realized. "You have a good eye," he said, setting the paper down. "Better than the men I pay specifically to notice these things." "I spend my days organizing chaos into columns that make sense," Maya said. "People are not that different, once you know what to look for." "I could use someone with that particular skill in a more permanent capacity." He said it carefully, watching her reaction. "Not as a secretary. Are you offering me a job in your organization, Mr. Tanaka? I am telling you that I trust very few people in this building, and you have become one of them faster than I intended to allow." The admission seemed to cost him something, a rare crack of honesty in a man built entirely from careful control. "That was not the plan when I hired you." "Plans change," Maya said, echoing something she suspected she would say more than once before this was over. The confession that followed was not romantic, not the kind of declaration a woman might dream about, but it landed with more weight than flowers or poetry ever could have. "You are the first person in this office who has ever looked at me and not seen only what I can do for them, or what I might do to them." Ishiro's voice was low, rough at the edges. "I told myself that keeping you close was a matter of usefulness. I no longer believe that is entirely true." Maya did not answer immediately, because the honesty in his voice deserved more than a quick response, and because something in her own chest had been building toward this admission for weeks, without her fully letting herself notice it. "I told myself I was staying because the money was good," she said finally. That stopped being true somewhere around the paperweight. Something almost like a smile moved across his face, brief, unpracticed, gone as quickly as it came, but she had seen it, and the sight of it did something to her resolve that she was not entirely prepared for, something that felt dangerously close to the beginning of no longer wanting to leave. Not the office, not the city, not him. The war between them and the Osaka faction reached its breaking point on a night Maya would replay for the rest of her life. She had stayed late again, this time reviewing shipment records Ishiro had asked her to cross-reference, when the building's power cut abruptly, plunging the 52nd floor into darkness broken only by the distant glow of the city outside the windows. She heard the elevator shaft groan somewhere below, heard the stairwell door bang open 2 floors down, and her stomach dropped with a certain knowledge that this was not a maintenance failure. She moved fast toward the inner office, where Ishiro was already on his feet, gun drawn, his associate Daisuke pressed against the wall beside the door with his own weapon ready. "They cut the cameras with the power," Daisuke said, low and urgent. "We do not know how many." "Maya, get down." Ishiro's voice was flat, commanding, but his eyes found hers for one fraction of a second, something raw and afraid moving beneath the calm, an emotion she suspected he rarely allowed himself to feel, let alone show. She did not get down. She moved instead to the small emergency panel near the study door, the one she had noticed weeks ago during a routine building tour, the one that controlled the auxiliary lighting circuit that ran independent of the main power grid. Her hands worked fast in the dark, flipping the manual override she had memorized out of nothing more than idle curiosity on a slow afternoon, and the hallway lights flickered back to life, just as the first intruder rounded the corner, momentarily blinded by the sudden brightness. The half-second of confusion was enough. Ishiro moved with brutal precision, and Daisuke covered the second angle, and the confrontation that could have ended in darkness and chaos instead played out under enough light for the men defending the office to see clearly what they were defending against. When it was over, 3 intruders lay incapacitated on the marble floor, and Ishiro stood over them breathing hard, a shallow cut along his forearm that he did not so much as glance at. "You could have been killed," he said, turning to Maya, fury and fear tangled together in his voice in a way she had never heard from him before. "So could you, in the dark, with no idea what you were shooting at." She held his gaze, refusing to shrink from his anger. "I fixed that. You are welcome." He crossed the distance between them in 3 fast strides, and for one wild second, she thought he might actually be angry enough to shout at her, something she had genuinely never witnessed. Instead, his hand came up to her jaw, gentler than anything she had seen from him before, and he studied her face like he was confirming with his own eyes that she was actually unhurt. "Do not do that again," he said, low and rough. "I am not going to promise you that." Maya held perfectly still under his hand, aware of every point of contact between them, aware of how close he was standing, close enough that she could smell the faint note of cedar and something darker beneath his cologne, close enough to see the fine white line of an old scar near his collarbone that his open shirt usually hid. I am not going to stand in the dark and do nothing while people I care about are in danger. The word care hung between them, deliberate or accidental she could not have said, and something in his eyes changed at the sound of it. Maya. Her name in his mouth again, the particular way he shaped it that no one else did, and this time she did not pretend not to notice what it did to her. He kissed her there in the ruined hallway, surrounded by unconscious enemies and flickering emergency lights, and it was not gentle or careful, it was certain and hungry, the kiss of a man who had spent months telling himself that wanting her was a weakness he could not afford and had finally stopped believing it. Maya kissed him back with the same certainty, her hands fisting in the front of his ruined shirt, and when they finally broke apart both of them were breathing unevenly in the wreckage of a night that had nearly gone very differently. "This changes things," Ishiro said, his forehead resting against hers. "It already changed weeks ago," Maya said. "We are just finally admitting it." The days that followed moved fast. The Osaka faction's failed attack triggering a chain of consequences that rippled through Ishiro's world with the same precision he brought to everything else. Maya found herself woven more deeply into the machinery of his organization, no longer simply the secretary who noticed patterns in delivery schedules, but a trusted presence whose instincts he relied on without hesitation. She did something during those tense days that she knew, even as she did it, would change how she saw herself afterward. She intercepted a communication meant for Ishiro's rivals, a message from someone inside his own organization feeding information to Osaka, and rather than bring it straight to him, she followed the thread herself first, tracing it back through the building's internal records until she had the traitor's name laid out with certainty. It was Daisuke, the man who had stood beside Ishiro in the dark, who had covered his blind side during the attack, had been selling information to Osaka for months, motivated by a debt Maya later learned had nothing to do with loyalty and everything to do with fear of a threat made against him personally. She brought the evidence to Ishiro directly rather than letting anyone else discover it first, understanding even as she did it that she was crossing into territory with no clean way back, territory where the consequences of betrayal in this world were absolute and irreversible. "You are certain," Ishiro said, studying the documentation she had assembled, his voice gone very quiet and very still. "I am certain." Maya met his eyes without flinching. "I checked it 3 times before I brought it to you. I did not want to be wrong about this. You should have brought it to me the moment you suspected." His voice carried an edge she had not heard directed at her before. "Not after you built an entire case alone. I needed to be sure before I destroyed a man's life." She held her ground. "You would have done the same thing in my position, and you know it." Something in his expression eased, the anger giving way to something more complicated, respect tangled with a kind of protective fear that she suspected he was not accustomed to feeling for anyone. "You cannot be part of what happens next," he said quietly. "I already am." Maya did not blink. "I am the one who found it." The final confrontation happened 2 nights later, in the private study where the first attack had unfolded weeks before, full circle in a way that felt inevitable once Maya saw the shape of it. Daisuke arrived expecting a routine meeting and found instead a room lined with the evidence of his betrayal laid bare across the desk, and the expression that crossed his face when he understood the trap confirmed everything the documents had already proven. He went for a weapon, fast and desperate, and Maya, standing near the door rather than safely outside it because she had refused Ishiro's order to wait in the outer office, moved without thinking, throwing her weight into the nearest bookshelf and sending a heavy stack of ledgers crashing down between Daisuke and his intended target. The distraction bought Ishiro the half-second he needed, and the confrontation ended the way these things always seemed to end in his world, fast, brutal, and final. Afterward, in the quiet that followed, Ishiro found Maya standing near the window, her hands still trembling slightly from adrenaline, and he crossed the room to stand beside her, without a word. "You keep inserting yourself into situations that could get you killed," he said, but there was no real anger left in it, only a kind of exhausted tenderness. You keep needing someone to watch your blind side. Maya looked up at him. It turns out that someone is me. He studied her for a long moment, something unguarded and certain settling into his features, an expression she had never once seen him wear in the months she had known him. I did not intend for any of this to happen when I hired a new secretary, he said. I intended to keep this life separate from anything I could not afford to lose. And now I do not know how to imagine this building without you in it. The admission seemed to cost him nothing this time, offered freely, no longer guarded behind careful distance. That terrifies me more than Osaka ever did. Good. Maya reached up and straightened his collar, a small domestic gesture that felt enormous given everything that had happened between them. Terror means it matters. I would rather have that than indifference. He caught her hand before she could pull it back, pressing it flat against his chest where she could feel his heartbeat, steady now that the danger had passed, steady in a way that felt like a promise neither of them needed to speak aloud. There is something else, he said after a moment, his voice quieter than she was used to hearing it. Reiko never knew what my silence cost her. I never let her close enough to understand what she was actually protecting herself from by staying out of it. I told myself that was mercy. He looked down at their joined hands. It was cowardice. I am not going to make that mistake with you. Then do not make it, Maya said simply. Tell me what I am walking into. All of it. I would rather know the whole shape of this life and choose it than be protected from a version of you that does not actually exist. That is a dangerous thing to ask a man like me. I already threw a paperweight at a man with a knife on my second week here. Maya allowed herself the smallest smile. I think we are past the point where you get to decide what I can handle. He exhaled something that was almost a laugh, rare and unguarded, and pulled her hand up to press his lips against her palm instead of her knuckles this time, a small deliberate shift that felt like its own kind of vow. Then I will tell you everything you ask to know, he said. Starting tomorrow. Tonight, I would simply like to stand here without either of us bleeding. I can agree to that. Weeks later, the office had settled into a new rhythm, the threat from Osaka resolved through channels Maya understood without needing every detail, the price paid quietly the way costs in this world always seem to be paid. Her desk still sat in the outer office, though her responsibilities had shifted into something neither of them had a formal title for yet, something built on trust rather than job description. The flowers had never returned, not because Ishiro forbade them again, but because Maya had stopped needing a small bouquet to prove to herself that she belonged in a space that had, somewhere along the way, become genuinely hers. She stood at the window one evening, watching the city lights spread out below in their endless glittering grid, and felt Ishiro's presence behind her before he spoke, the particular quality of stillness that always announced him without a sound. I have been thinking about your first day, he said, coming to stand beside her, his hand finding hers with an ease that had once felt impossible between them. About the flowers. You had them removed before I could even ask why. I know. He turned to look at her, something almost soft in his expression, softer than anything the office had ever witnessed from him. I think, if I am honest, I was afraid of exactly what eventually happened. Something bright and alive in a place built entirely for control. I did not know yet that I wanted it there. Maya studied his face, the careful stillness that had once seemed impenetrable now familiar to her in every small variation, every flicker of feeling he no longer bothered hiding from her. And now I think this office could use more color. He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture so unlike the man who had once ordered her flowers thrown out within minutes of her arrival that Maya felt something settle deep in her chest, something that finally felt permanent. The following morning, Maya arrived to find a small glass vase already waiting on her desk, empty, deliberately placed, a silent invitation rather than an apology, because Ishiro Tanaka did not apologize in words when an action would say it more precisely. She filled it that afternoon with a handful of white carnations from the same corner shop near her apartment, and when he passed through the outer office and saw them sitting there in the morning light, he did not order them removed. He only paused beside her desk a moment longer than necessary, his hand brushing lightly across her shoulder as he passed, a touch so small no one else in the room would have noticed it, and yet it told her everything she needed to know about how far they had both traveled since her first terrifying, humiliating, electrifying morning in this office. Maya watched him disappear into the inner office and turned back to her work with a small private smile that had nothing to do with columns of numbers or discrepancies in a ledger. Outside the window, the city carried on, indifferent to the quiet transformation happening in a 52nd floor office where a woman who once refused to let a dangerous man dictate what she was allowed to keep had, in the end, kept far more than a vase of carnations. She had kept herself entirely intact inside a world built to erode people down to what was useful, and she had done it without asking his permission a single time. That, she thought, watching the door close behind him, was the only victory that had ever really mattered.